The first night that breaks prisoners. The first night doesn't feel like punishment. At least, not at first. There's no shouting, no violence, no chaos. Just a door closing somewhere behind you, heavy final, and a silence so complete it feels artificial. Most prisoners think the sentence begins when the judge speaks. Some think it starts when the cuffs go on. Others believe it begins when the cell door shuts. They're all wrong. The sentence begins on the first night, when the rules stop being explained. No one tells you what time it is. No one tells you how long you'll be there. No one tells you what comes next. The light doesn't turn off when you expect it to. Sometimes it doesn't turn off at all. You lie on a thin mattress, staring at a ceiling designed not for comfort, but for observation. Every surface around you is intentional. Every angle calculated. Every sound, or lack of it, deliberate. This is the moment most prisoners make their first mistake. They try to stay alert. They try to stay defiant. They tell themselves this is temporary. But the first night isn't about fear. It's about realization. Realizing that nothing you do changes anything. You can stand. You can sit. You can pace the length of the cell. 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. The cell doesn't respond. The system doesn't respond. There are no guards yelling orders. No one watching you react. And that's the point. Because control isn't taken by force here. It's taken by absence. By removing feedback. By removing resistance. By removing the sense that your choices matter. Some prisoners talk to themselves on the first night. Not because they're losing their minds, but because silence feels threatening. Others lie completely still, afraid that moving might somehow make things worse. Sleep doesn't come easily. When it does, it doesn't feel like rest. It feels like surrender. And somewhere in that first night, usually without realizing it, something shifts. The mind stops asking why. It stops planning. It stops resisting. This documentary is not about a specific prison. It's about what happens before a prisoner ever accepts where they are. Because once the first night ends, the system doesn't need to break you anymore. You've already started doing it yourself. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. Arrival without orientation. No one explains what is happening when a prisoner first arrives. There is no welcome, no orientation video, no moment where someone outlines what to expect. The system does not begin with information. It begins with disorientation. Most arrivals happen quietly, often at night or early morning, when the facility is at its calmest. Transport vehicles don't pull in with drama or urgency. They move slowly, deliberately, passing through multiple control gates that open and close without conversation. Each barrier removes another sense of location. Another reference point disappears. By the time the vehicle stops, most prisoners no longer know where they are, only that they have arrived somewhere permanent. Doors open. Instructions are short, neutral, emotionless. Step out. Face forward. Hands visible. There are no raised voices. No threats. No need for force. Compliance at this stage isn't demanded. It's assumed. And that assumption is powerful. Because when a system expects obedience without resistance, it signals something more intimidating than authority. Total control. The first steps inside are not marked by fear. They are marked by confusion. The building does not resemble what most people imagine a prison to be. There are no long corridors filled with shouting, no visible population, no chaos. The space is intentionally quiet. Sound is absorbed by thick walls, reinforced doors, and architectural design meant to isolate noise as effectively as people. This silence is not accidental. Silence removes feedback. Feedback creates orientation. Orientation creates a sense of control. So silence becomes a first tool. Prisoners are led through hallways that offer no visual information. Windows are absent or frosted. Corners turn sharply, making it impossible to track direction. Lighting is functional but flat, designed to illuminate without warmth. Everything looks clean, impersonal, and temporary, even though nothing about the situation is temporary at all. Time begins to blur almost immediately. There are no clocks visible, No announcements, no sense of schedule. A person's internal rhythm, already disrupted by transport, begins to drift. Hunger, fatigue, and adrenaline overlap in confusing ways. The body knows it should be tired, but the mind refuses to slow down. This is not accidental either. Disorientation weakens resistance more effectively than fear ever could. At some point, the intake process begins, but it does not feel like a process. It feels like a sequence of unrelated events, a command to stand still, a request for personal information that has already been recorded elsewhere, a pause that lasts too long, a room that feels colder than necessary. Personal belongings are removed with efficiency that borders on indifference. Each item is handled not as property, but as an object temporarily out of place. Shoes, clothing, identification. Everything that once signaled individuality is separated and cataloged. The prisoner is not told where these items are going. They are not told when or if they will see them again. Questions are rarely answered, not because staff are being cruel, but because uncertainty is built into the system. When information is withheld, the mind fills the gaps, and the mind is far harsher than any rule book. Medical checks are brief. Psychological evaluations are often subtle. Sometimes nothing more than observation. How does the person stand? Do they fidget? Do they make eye contact? Do they ask too many questions? The system is not looking for conversation. It is looking for predictability. This is the moment many prisoners expect the process to end, for someone to finally explain what comes next. That moment never comes. Instead, they are escorted again. Another hallway, another controlled door, another stretch of silence. At some point, the cell appears. Not suddenly, but gradually, as though it has always been there waiting. The door opens. The space inside is smaller than expected, but not claustrophobic. That distinction matters. Claustrophobia triggers panic. This space is designed to do the opposite. The cell feels neutral, controlled, almost calm. A bed, a sink, a toilet, smooth surfaces, no sharp edges. Everything looks permanent, and permanence changes how a person thinks. There is no dramatic moment when the door closes, no cinematic slam, just a solid, final sound that doesn't echo, because the walls absorb it. That's when the orientation truly ends. No one explains how long the prisoner will stay here. No one explains what behavior is expected. No one explains how to request information. The assumption is simple. You will figure it out. The door locks. Footsteps move away. And for the first time since arrival, the prisoner is alone. This is not isolation yet, not psychologically. This is something more subtle. It is removal from reference. There are no voices to react to, no signals to interpret, no cues to follow. The mind searches for patterns, something familiar to anchor itself to, and finds nothing. Minutes stretch unnaturally. The light remains on. Or sometimes, it dims without warning. The temperature feels regulated, but not comfortable, just enough to prevent restlessness, not enough to feel humane. The prisoner sits, then stands, then sits again. There is nothing to do, and no clear indication of when something will happen. This is where the system gains its advantage, because the human brain is designed to respond to interaction, even negative interaction, especially negative interaction. But here there is none. No conflict, no confrontation, no immediate threat, just waiting. Some prisoners spend the first hour replaying decisions, trying to trace the exact moment their life veered off course. Others focus on small details in the cell, counting screws, examining seams, tracing the outline of the door with their eyes. Anything to regain a sense of agency. But agency requires choice, and choice requires options. By the time the first night approaches, most prisoners begin to understand something important, though they may not yet have the words for it. This place does not respond to emotion. Anger produces nothing. Fear produces nothing. Compliance produces nothing. The system is not reactive. It is static, and static systems do not negotiate. This realization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles slowly like weight, and as the first night approaches, the The question shifts. Not what will they do to me, but how long will this feel like this? That question has no answer. And that uncertainty, unresolved, persistent, and intentional, is what defines the beginning of the sentence. Because before punishment can shape behavior, before rules can enforce obedience, before time can reshape identity, orientation must be removed. And once a person no longer knows where they are when they are, or what comes next, they are ready for whatever the system decides to give them. Sensory control. The most effective prisons are not loud. They do not rely on shouting, visible force, or constant confrontation. They rely on something far more precise. Control of the senses. From the moment a prisoner is placed inside the cell, the environment begins communicating rules. Silently, continuously, and without explanation. Nothing in the space is random. The walls are smooth but not comforting. The color is neutral but not calming. The air feels clean but oddly lifeless. The cell is designed to feel complete, as though everything a person could possibly need already exists within its boundaries. And that illusion is intentional, because when the environment appears self-contained, the mind slowly stops expecting anything beyond it. The first sense to be altered is sound. Most people expect prisons to be noisy places, doors slamming, voices echoing, movement, conflict. But here, sound behaves differently. The walls absorb it. The doors seal it. The architecture prevents it from traveling. Even when something happens nearby, it rarely reaches a cell clearly enough to be understood. A distant metallic click, a muted vibration, a low mechanical hum. Nothing identifiable, nothing reassuring. The brain is wired to interpret sound as information. When sound loses clarity, the brain works hard to make sense of it, and that effort creates fatigue. Silence in this environment is not peaceful. It is work. Prisoners often describe the silence as pressurized, not empty but heavy, as if something is missing that should be there. This absence forces the mind inward. Thoughts grow louder. Memories replay with sharper edges. Time stretches, and that brings the next sense under control. Sight. Cells are brightly lit, but the light is flat. It does not cast comforting shadows or indicate warmth. It simply reveals. There are no visual markers of time passing. No windows with meaningful views. No changing scenery. No gradual shifts in light that suggest morning or evening. Even when windows exist, they are placed too high, too narrow, or too distorted to provide orientation. The sky, if visible at all, becomes abstract. Blue does not mean morning. Dark does not mean night. The mind loses its most basic reference point. And when time can't be visually tracked, it stops feeling real. The third sense under control is touch. Every surface inside the cell has a purpose, not to comfort, but to regulate behavior. The bed is firm, but not painful. The floor is cold, but not unbearable. The walls offer no texture worth exploring. There are no soft edges, nothing to grip, nothing that invites lingering contact. This discourages restlessness without encouraging relaxation. It is an environment designed to prevent extremes, because extremes lead to action. The system does not want action. It wants stillness. Even clothing plays a role. Standard issue garments remove personal identity, but more importantly, they dull sensation. Fabric is neither coarse nor soft. Shoes are neither comfortable nor restrictive. Everything feels acceptable, and acceptable conditions are dangerous because they delay resistance. Taste and smell are regulated next. Meals are predictable. Flavors are muted. Smells are minimal. Food becomes fuel, not pleasure. The body receives what it needs to survive, but not enough to feel human satisfaction. This reduces emotional spikes, and emotional spikes lead to behavior. In a system designed around observation, behavior is something to be minimized. The final sense under control is the most important one of all, time perception. Without sensory variation, time becomes unstable. Minutes feel like hours. Hours disappear entirely. Days lose shape. Prisoners begin marking time through internal cues instead of external ones. Hunger, fatigue, restlessness, mental loops. But those cues are unreliable. Hunger arrives late. Sleep comes inconsistently. Fatigue deepens without warning. The brain struggles to build routine, and routine is how humans maintain psychological balance. This is where many prisoners make their second mistake. They try to create structure. They count steps. They invent schedules. They assign meaning to sounds. But when those self-created systems fail, when a sound doesn't repeat or a routine is disrupted without explanation, the sense of control collapses again. And collapse is exhausting. The system does not need to punish attempts at control. It simply allows them to fail. Over time, the mind adapts, not by resisting, but by lowering expectations. A prisoner stops waiting for change, stops reacting to uncertainty, stops asking internal questions that have no answers. This adaptation looks like calm from the outside, but internally it is withdrawal. The senses dull further, thoughts slow, motivation fades. The environment hasn't changed, but the person inside it has. This is the true function of sensory control, not to cause immediate distress, but to reshape how the mind interacts with reality. By limiting stimulation, the system reduces emotional volatility. By flattening sensory input, it weakens internal resistance. By destabilizing time, it removes urgency. And when urgency disappears, so does hope. Not dramatically, not all at once. Hope fades quietly. It fades between moments, between breaths, between thoughts. By the end of the second phase, often without realizing it, prisoners stop measuring time in days. They measure it in states of mind. Alert, tired, numb, detached. The environment has taught them something crucial. Nothing changes because you want it to. And once the senses stop expecting change, the mind stops demanding it. That is when control is no longer enforced. It is accepted. Sleep deprivation. Sleep is the last thing the system fully takes. Not because it is difficult to remove, but because it is more effective when it disappears slowly. On the first night, most prisoners believe exhaustion will eventually overpower everything else. They assume that when the body finally gives in, sleep will arrive naturally, offering at least a temporary escape from the silence. That belief does not survive long. The body lies down, but the mind stays alert. The eyes close, but the senses remain engaged. The light does not behave like light should. Sometimes it stays on. Sometimes it dims without fully disappearing. Sometimes it changes intensity, so subtly it's hard to tell whether it changed at all. There is no clear signal that it is time to rest. And without that signal, the brain refuses to shut down. Prisoners lie still, listening for something, anything, that might indicate the outside world is still moving. A voice, footsteps, a distant door, but the silence holds. Breathing becomes louder. Heartbeats feel intrusive. Thoughts circle without direction. Sleep does not arrive gently. It arrives in fragments. Short, shallow lapses where consciousness fades just long enough to disorient, then snaps back awake. These moments do not feel like rest. They feel like falling. The body jerks awake, unsure how much time has passed. Seconds feel like hours. Hours disappear entirely. And when sleep fails repeatedly, the mind begins to change its behavior. Instead of preparing to rest, it prepares to endure. Thoughts become sharper at first, more focused, hyper-aware. The brain scans the environment relentlessly, searching for threats that never appear. This heightened alertness is not fear. It is survival instinct misfiring. The system has not created danger. It has removed certainty. And uncertainty keeps the mind awake longer than fear ever could. As the hours stretch on, the body begins to react. Muscles tense without reason. The jaw tightens. Eyes burn from dryness and strain. Hunger and fatigue overlap in confusing ways. The body sends signals that no longer match reality. Prisoners often misjudge how long they've been awake. Some believe it has been a full night when only minutes have passed. Others believe hours have gone by when it has been nearly an entire day. Time loses coherence. This is not accidental. Sleep deprivation weakens memory, disrupts emotional regulation, and reduces impulse control. It does not need to be extreme to be effective. It only needs to be consistent. And consistency is the system's strength. By the second night, most prisoners stop expecting proper sleep altogether. They adjust their posture, attempting to find positions that feel less exposed. Some sleep facing the wall. Others lie rigid on their backs, afraid that movement might somehow draw attention, even though no one is watching. Sleep becomes something to be stolen, not received. Short intervals, unpredictable, unrestful, and with each failed attempt at rest, the internal narrative changes. At first, the mind asks questions. Why is the light still on? Why hasn't anyone come by? Is this intentional? Then the questions become statements. This place doesn't follow normal rules. There is no schedule I can rely on. Nothing I do influences what happens next. That shift is subtle, but it is critical, because once the brain stops expecting cause and effect, it stops forming plans. Planning requires sleep. Hope requires rest. Without sleep, even the strongest mental defenses erode. Emotions flatten. Reactions dull. The urgency to think, to reason, to resist, fades. Prisoners often report that memories begin to surface during these periods of exhaustion, not deliberately, not chronologically. Fragments appear without warning. Faces, voices, moments that feel painfully vivid. The mind, deprived of external stimulation, turns inward and not always safely. Some memories replay with distortion. Others feel more real than the cell itself. And because the prisoner cannot confirm the passage of time, these internal experiences blur with the present. The line between thought and perception weakens. This is when the first internal fractures appear. Not hallucinations, not yet, but misinterpretations. A mechanical sound feels intentional. A change in lighting feels targeted. A pause in silence feels meaningful. The brain is searching for patterns because it cannot tolerate randomness. And when it cannot find real ones, it creates its own. Sleep deprivation does not cause breakdowns instantly. It causes drift, a slow separation between perception and reality. The prisoner becomes less confident in their own interpretations, less certain that what they feel aligns with what is happening. This uncertainty feeds back into the system, because a person who does not trust their own senses is easier to manage than one who resists openly. By the third or fourth night, many prisoners stop lying down entirely. They sit, they lean against the wall. They rest in awkward positions that prevent full sleep but reduce vulnerability. The bed becomes symbolic rather than functional. Lying down feels like giving up awareness, and awareness feels like the only remaining defense. This constant vigilance accelerates exhaustion. Reaction times slow. Thoughts lose complexity. Language, even internal language, simplifies. Complex reasoning gives way to short conclusions. This will not change. I cannot affect this. I need to stop expecting relief. These thoughts are not dramatic. They are quiet. They sound like acceptance. But acceptance under sleep deprivation is not peace. It is surrender disguised as calm. At this stage, prisoners often stop tracking nights altogether. There's only before rest and after rest. Even though neither state feels complete, the body survives. The mind adapts. But something essential has shifted. Sleep deprivation has removed the last reliable reset. Without sleep, emotions cannot stabilize. Without sleep, memories cannot organize. Without sleep, stress compounds instead of releasing. The prisoner is no longer processing experiences. They are accumulating them, and accumulation leads to overload. This is the moment the system is designed to reach. Not exhaustion, not panic, but mental fatigue so deep that resistance feels unnecessary. Because fighting requires energy, and energy has been carefully, methodically drained. By now, the prisoner understands something without being told. The cell does not need to hurt them. The guards do not need to threaten them. The system does not need to escalate. Sleep deprivation has already done the work. It has softened the mind, slowed the thoughts, lowered the threshold for compliance. And in that softened state, something dangerous happens. The mind begins to protect itself, not by resisting, but by withdrawing. Thoughts shorten, emotions mute, expectations collapse inward. This is not the breakdown yet. This is the preparation, the quiet moment before the mind decides that feeling less is safer than feeling fully. And once that decision is made, often without conscious awareness, the first internal breakdown is no longer a threat. It is inevitable, because a mind that cannot rest, cannot recover, and a mind that cannot recover will eventually change, not to escape the environment, but to survive it. The first internal breakdown. The first internal breakdown is not dramatic. There is no shouting, no sudden collapse, no moment that feels like losing control. That is why it is so dangerous. By the time it happens, the prisoner is already adjusted to the environment. The silence no longer feels foreign. The lighting no longer feels intrusive. The lack of sleep has become routine rather than alarming. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. From inside, something has quietly failed. The mind reaches this point because it has been working continuously without recovery. Thoughts have been looping without resolution. Sensory input has been flattened. Sleep has been fractured into unusable fragments. At first, the brain tries to compensate. It simplifies decisions. It narrows focus. It reduces emotional range. This feels like control, but it is actually contraction. One of the earliest signs is the loss of internal dialogue. Prisoners often report that their thoughts stop forming full sentences. Ideas appear as fragments. Conclusions form without reasoning. The mind no longer debates or weighs options. It chooses the path of least resistance automatically. This is not clarity. It is cognitive fatigue. Another sign appears in memory. Recent events lose order. Days blend together. Cause and effect disconnect. A prisoner may remember something happening, but not when or whether it happened yesterday or several days ago. This creates a subtle instability, because memory is how the mind confirms reality. When memory becomes unreliable, confidence in perception weakens. And when perception weakens, the mind turns inward for safety. This inward turn is where the breakdown begins. The prisoner stops reacting emotionally to their environment, not because they feel calm, but because emotional reaction feels pointless. Anger fades first. Anger requires energy. It also requires the belief that something can change. That belief is already gone. Fear follows. Fear depends on uncertainty. By now, the uncertainty has stabilized into expectation. Nothing changes. Nothing improves. Nothing escalates. The mind adapts by numbing its responses. This numbing does not feel like emptiness at first. It feels like relief. Relief from thinking. Relief from reacting. Relief from hoping. That relief is deceptive, because once emotions flatten, identity begins to erode. A person defines themselves through choices, reactions, and relationships. But in this environment, choices have no visible effect. Reactions produce no response. Relationships do not exist. Without feedback, identity loses reinforcement. The prisoner stops thinking in terms of who they are. Thoughts shift toward what they are. An inmate, a body in a cell, a presence to be managed. Language changes internally. Instead of I will, thoughts become it will. Instead of I want, they become there is no point. This linguistic shift is subtle, but it reflects a deeper psychological change. Agency is being surrendered. The first internal breakdown often includes moments of detachment. The prisoner may observe themselves as if from a distance, watching their own movements, listening to their own thoughts as if they belong to someone else. This is not psychosis. It is dissociation, the mind's way of creating distance from stress it cannot escape. Dissociation reduces pain in the short term, but it also disconnects the individual from emotional reality. Time becomes even more distorted. Hours feel both endless and meaningless. Events lack emotional weight. The future stops feeling relevant. This is why many prisoners describe this phase as going quiet inside. Not silence, but absence. At this stage, behavior changes. Movements become slower. Gestures become minimal. Posture collapses inward. The body mirrors the mind's withdrawal. Guards may interpret this as compliance. Administrators may interpret it as stability. But psychologically, this is the moment the prisoner stops resisting internally. not because they have accepted the sentence, but because resistance has become unsustainable. This is the first internal breakdown. It is not a crisis. It is a reorganization. The mind is not breaking apart. It is breaking down unnecessary functions. Hope, expectation, anticipation. These are expensive mental processes. And in an environment where nothing changes, they are liabilities. So the mind discards them. What remains is a narrowed version of consciousness focused on immediate survival. Eat when food arrives. Move when instructed. Rest when exhaustion permits. Nothing more. This state can persist for long periods. Days, weeks, months. And because it does not appear chaotic, it often goes unnoticed. But the cost is permanent. Once a person learns to exist without emotional investment, relearning engagement becomes difficult, sometimes impossible. The first internal breakdown is not the end of psychological damage. It is the foundation. Everything that follows, identity loss, emotional numbing, long-term detachment, builds on this moment. Because once the mind accepts that feeling less is safer than feeling fully, it will continue to protect itself the same way, long after the cell door opens, long after the sentence changes, long after the environment shifts. The system does not need to destroy a person. It only needs to convince the mind to turn itself down. And by the time the first internal breakdown has passed, that work is already done. Emotional numbing and erosion of identity. After the first internal breakdown, the mind does not collapse further. It stabilizes, and that stability is what makes this phase so dangerous. Emotional numbing does not arrive as pain. It arrives as quiet efficiency. The prisoner wakes, or believes they wake, without urgency. There is no rush of thought, no emotional reaction to the environment. The cell looks the same as it did before, but it no longer feels oppressive. Not because conditions have improved, but because the mind has adjusted its expectations downward. This adjustment is subtle. The brain begins filtering experience more aggressively. Emotional responses are shortened, blunted, or eliminated altogether. Events that would normally provoke reaction, a delay, a sudden sound, a change in routine, register briefly, then disappear. Nothing lingers. This is not peace. It is emotional shutdown. At this stage, many prisoners stop feeling time pass emotionally. Days move forward, but they do not accumulate meaning. Memories no longer form clearly because memory relies on emotional markers to organize experience. Without emotional contrast, everything blends. Meals become indistinguishable. Days lose separation. Sleep, when it happens, leaves no sense of restoration. The mind exists in a flattened present. This flattening affects identity directly. Identity is not a fixed trait. It is maintained through interaction, through decision-making, through reaction, through recognition by others. Inside prolonged isolation, none of those mechanisms exist. There is no audience, no acknowledgement, no confirmation that choices matter. So the concept of self weakens. The prisoner stops thinking about who they were before incarceration, not because those memories are painful, but because they feel irrelevant. The past begins to feel fictional. Names, places, relationships. They still exist intellectually, but emotionally they no longer connect. The mind does not erase them. It detaches from them. This detachment is functional. Thinking about identity creates longing. Longing creates distress. Distress requires energy. The system has already removed energy through sleep deprivation and sensory control. Now the mind completes the process by letting go of emotional attachment. This is when language changes further. Internal thoughts lose narrative form. Instead of imagining future scenarios or recalling detailed memories, the mind operates in short, transactional statements. Food arrived, light changed, noise occurred. Experience becomes observational rather than participatory. This shift reduces suffering, but it also removes meaning. Emotional numbing affects the body as well. Facial expressions become limited. Posture collapses inward. Movement slow, not from weakness, but from lack of motivation. There is no reward for speed, no penalty for stillness. The body mirrors the mind's economy of effort. At this point, compliance becomes effortless, not because the prisoner agrees with the system, but because resistance feels unnecessary. Resistance implies possibility. Possibility implies hope. Hope has already been discarded. From the outside, this looks like adaptation. Administrators may label it adjustment. Reports may describe the prisoner as stable. Behavioral logs may show reduced incidents. But internally, something essential has been muted. The prisoner is no longer fully present. They are surviving through detachment. This detachment can feel protective. Thoughts no longer spiral. Anxiety no longer peaks. Emotional pain loses its sharpness. But protection has a cost. The mind is not selective about what it numbs. It dulls distress and everything else with it. Curiosity fades. Creativity disappears. Desire weakens. The prisoner stops imagining alternatives, not because alternatives are impossible, but because imagining them produces no emotional response. This is the quiet death of agency. Without agency, identity becomes abstract. The prisoner knows who they're supposed to be legally, administratively, but that identity feels external. It belongs to paperwork, not to experience. The internal sense of self shrinks to basic awareness. I exist. I wait. I endure. This condition can persist for extended periods without obvious breakdown. That is what makes it efficient. There are no incidents to report, no visible crises, no disruption to routine. But recovery from this state is difficult because emotional numbing is not a reaction. It is a learned strategy. The mind has decided that feeling less is safer. And once that decision is reinforced over time, reversing it becomes challenging, even when circumstances change, even when isolation ends, even when the environment becomes less restrictive. The nervous system does not immediately respond. Emotions do not return on command. Connection feels unfamiliar. Stimulation feels overwhelming. Choice feels burdensome. The skills required to be human again, engagement, emotional risk, vulnerability, have atrophied. This is why the effects of prolonged isolation extend beyond confinement. The damage is not only situational, it is structural. The mind has been reshaped to survive an environment where meaning was dangerous, and survival required reduction, not expansion. By this stage, the system no longer needs to impose control. The prisoner has internalized it. They do not expect relief. They do not anticipate change. They do not invest emotionally. They exist within the boundaries given and no longer test them. This is the outcome the system was designed to achieve. Not fear, not obedience through force, but psychological minimization. A person reduced to what is necessary to function, and nothing more. Emotional numbing is not the end of suffering. It is the end of resistance. And once resistance disappears, the system operates without friction, silently, efficiently, indefinitely, what the system really takes. By the time emotional numbing sets in, the work of the system is largely complete. There is no longer a need for constant enforcement, raised voices, or visible pressure. Control has already moved inward. The cell no longer has to dominate the body. The mind has learned to regulate itself. This is the part most people never see. From the outside, isolation appears clean, quiet, controlled. There are no bruises to photograph, no chaos to document, no obvious violence to condemn. But what disappears inside these cells is not disorder. It is complexity. The complexity of thought, the complexity of emotion, the complexity of identity. A human being is not broken by one event, one night, or one punishment. They are reduced gradually through systems designed to remove feedback, eliminate choice, and make emotional investment feel unsafe. What makes this process so effective is that it rarely looks like harm. It looks like routine. It looks like order. It looks like stability. And stability is easy to defend. The first night introduces disorientation. Sensory control flattens perception. Sleep deprivation weakens resistance. The first internal breakdown reorganizes a mind. Emotional numbing preserves survival at the cost of identity. Each step feels survivable on its own. Together, they form something far more permanent. This documentary was not about a single prison, a single policy, or a single punishment. It was about a method, one that operates quietly, predictably, and with remarkable efficiency. A method that does not need to hurt the body, to change the person. Because when a system removes time, sensation, sleep, and meaning, it does not need to destroy a human being. It only needs to wait. The most unsettling truth is not that these environments exist. It's that they work. They work because the human mind adapts. They work because survival comes before dignity. They work because feeling less can be safer than feeling fully. And once the mind learns that lesson, it does not easily forget it. Long after confinement ends, long after the door opens, long after the sentence changes, what remains is not always visible, but it is real, and it raises a question that extends far beyond prison walls. If a system can reduce a person without ever touching them, what does that say about how power is exercised and how quietly it can reshape a human life? Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.